IB Environmental students, today we're going to be talking about energy resources. Make sure you're going to be paying attention to the various different types and be thinking about what makes a society pick a particular type of energy resource based on some of the advantages and disadvantages. All right, let's begin. Our first objective is really just talking about the various different types. You guys should have jotted some stuff down from that reading. Just make sure you've gotten a very strong variety listed. Here are just a couple. Do note that the relative use of these different forms is really going to depend on how much of them are available, the type of place, what people are interested in, tradition. And really what you need to think about is applying this to what we already know about natural capital and those types of resources, some of which are non-renewable. Which of these types are? So think about what you remember and really do look at which things are listed as non-renewable versus renewable. Do note that for energy resources, even things that are considered replenishable resources are now being placed in renewable. So do be careful when we're talking about energy, not getting confused with renewable, replenishable. Now they're combined when we're talking about energy. All right, during class we'll talk about more of these in depth. For now, we're going to pick two of them to compare some of the advantages and disadvantages after we first think about how much is really available of these things and how much we're using. So here's consumption over time. You've seen some of these things. You don't need to write this graph down, but do look. We are overall on the planet using more resources than we have ever done before. Some of that has to do with how many people are on the planet, and we even can see that this model is projecting out into the future. Some things we use more of, and we can talk about why. It's also important to know that for some of these non-renewables, some of them are slowly disappearing. So just think about that in how these consumptions are changing over time. When will some of these things run out, or why might some of those non-renewables run out? Well, a lot of it's about how much actual or potential supply there is. So think about our mountaintop mining simulation, how hard it was to get the pretend coal out of the donut. After a while, it's hard to get the last potential supply out. It's much more expensive. And it also is going to depend on how much we're using them, rate of consumption, which is a lot to do with supply and demand. Here's our comparison. We're going to do advantages and disadvantages. Pause so you get this on your screen, and you might need to make it bigger. So first, let's look at a non-renewable. This is for objective 332, and this goes right into that chart there on your objective sheet. Advantages are going to be as follows. Coal is a very pretty big supply, and because of that, it's rather cheap, and there's a lot more potential supplies out there. All things considered, since we can put this on a different sorts of transportation system without it going bad or hurting someone, all things considered, is easy to transport and can even be transported between countries, so it makes a lot of money, and it's relatively cheap. And it's easy to distribute. Disadvantages: it's a high cost to actually mine it, even though it's sold for rather cheap. Some of that has to do with government subsidies. Overall, all things considered, given that it's a fossil fuel, it doesn't have a really high energy yield compared to some other things. It also takes a lot of water to process. Some coal is considered dirty coal, and oftentimes we use water and other chemicals to clean the coal out. We'll talk more about that during air pollution later in the year. Sometimes there's a lot of disruptions during surface mining. Think about the mountaintop case studies we've been learning about. There's also going to be some water pollution during that mining process, air pollution when we're burning it, and coal is a fossil fuel which releases carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which we'll talk more about the implications of that when we get to our global climate change unit. We're going to compare that to our renewable resource here, solar power, which has a lot of advantages, but similarly a lot of disadvantages. So I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, because it depends on what our purpose and goal is. So advantages are there's a really high energy yield. The sun's not going away other than with clouds. That given, it only works, it can work on cloudy days. It's not going to work quite as well, but our technology is such that we can get some out of that. It does have a quick installation once we have the parts. We can expand or move them these days. There's no CO2 emissions. All things considered, there's not a big environmental impact. Doesn't take up that much space, although it does take up some space. We can now put them in nice places. and it reduces the dependence on fossil fuels. All things considered, though, I cannot put this in a place that's always going to get sun, so that's a disadvantage unless there's sun there. When we think about how it works with the grid, it can sometimes have a low efficiency. We need some place to store it. I don't always have a need for the energy when there's sun available, so there's not really good systems out there to back up the extra energy that we're getting. There's also going to be some land use. If there are big solar fields, that could disrupt some land area if I'm not putting it on a residential house. And some people think they're ugly, and so that's called not in my backyard, NIMBY. And people don't like them. They are super expensive to first install. That cost is really tough. Some places have tax breaks for it, and some energy grids don't yet have conversions. Last objective are societies and energy resources. So most more economically developed places are going to have really interesting differences in their use of energy resources. For instance, Iceland really relies on geothermal, and they have that ability, they have the finances to set that up, and they also have it available. China and US and Russia, they're going to use coal because it's cheap, and that's what their economic focus is right now. The US, some of the reasons we depend on oil and coal is it's cultural, it's social. Our cars are built for that, and that's what we're used to. So a lot of these things are tradition. A lot of them have to do with our economic goals. The EU, a lot of it's nuclear power there. That's what they are trained on. They have the technology to do it, and they find the environmental benefits are worthwhile, not having all of the disadvantages of some of the fossil fuels. LEDCs, on the other hand, whether that's a place in Africa or some rural parts of Asia or something like that, or some parts of Latin America, they're oftentimes going to use wood, the biomass, even dung or biofuels. Those things are cheap, easily collected, and they don't always have the technology available. We're going to do some more in-depth case studies in class, but good job, guys. I hope you got some of those key details, and come in ready if you have questions. All right, great. Bye.